The courtroom was a tomb. Cold air, stale with the scent of old paper and desperation, hung heavy. All eyes were on Walter Green, a man who looked older than his 60 years, his back bowed by a lifetime of hard labor and quiet sacrifice. The judge's words cut through the silence, sharp and final, life sentence. Walter closed his eyes. He had known this was coming. His hands, calloused and thick from decades of factory work, were cuffed. He was just an old man, a nobody, accused of a crime he didn't commit. The world had already judged him a thief, a liar, a man unworthy of mercy. It seemed the sacrifice he had made for 2 children he found in an alley was all for nothing. The cruel irony tasted like ash. As the judge's gavel lifted, ready to seal his fate forever, a sound broke the silence. The heavy courtroom doors swung open, and 2 figures stepped inside. What they revealed would shake the entire room and prove that some debts, the ones paid with a kind heart, are never truly forgotten. The winter that year was merciless. It didn't just bite. It gnawed. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and stayed there, a constant ache. In the small industrial town of Blackwood, streets smelled of burnt coal and cold steel. People hurried home, their heads down, their collars high, ignoring the wind and everything it blew their way. Walter Green, a man in his late 50s with a limp that never healed, walked from the factory gates. Every step was a protest from his worn-out body. His boss, a man named Marcus Harlon, had just finished his daily ritual of public humiliation. "Green," he'd yelled across the factory floor, "even the rust on this machine moves faster than you. You're lucky I let you work here, you old stray." The other workers had snickered. Walter just swallowed the insult, as he always did, and kept walking. He turned down the familiar alley behind a diner, the one he passed every night. The low hum of the freezer fans was usually the only sound. But tonight, a new sound mixed in, a faint, whimpering cry. Tucked against a rusted dumpster were 2 children. They were little more than shadows in the dim light. Their clothes were thin rags, their bodies shivering. The boy, who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, had his arm wrapped around his younger sister, shielding her from the bitter wind. Walter stopped. His mind, trained by years of poverty and Harlan's sneers, screamed at him to keep walking. Don't get involved. You can barely feed yourself. You have nothing to give. And it was true. His meals were often just scraps he carried in a paper bag. His room was a cold box, barely warmed by a tiny, rattling heater. He was just as much of a stray as they were. But looking at the 2 small figures, seeing the absolute despair in their eyes, a different feeling rose in him. It was a pull stronger than hunger, stronger than the fear of his boss. It was the simple truth that he couldn't leave them there to die. He crouched, his old knees protesting with a sharp crack. The children looked up, their eyes wide with a fear that seemed too old for their young faces. "You 2 got anywhere to go?" he asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. Silence. The boy just shook his head. Walter let out a slow breath that fogged in the air. He knew what it meant to be invisible, to be a nobody. "Not tonight," he said. He reached out a calloused hand, palm up. "Come on." The boy hesitated, but the little girl's tiny, ice-cold fingers slipped into Walter's palm. And that was enough. The walk back to his apartment was a slow procession. As they passed his neighbors, windows cracked open, and whispers followed them like a trail of smoke. "Look at that fool," a man muttered. "Old man can't pay his own bills, and now he's dragging strays inside." A woman shook her head, a smirk on her face. "He'll sink with them." Walter heard every word. He always heard, but he just kept walking, 2 fragile lives following in his footsteps. His apartment was no palace. It was just a small 1-room space with peeling wallpaper, a sagging couch, and a heater that rattled like a death cough. But it was warm. He laid blankets across the couch and heated up the last of his vegetable broth. He watched as the children ate, their faces finally relaxing as the food warmed them from the inside out. That night, as he sat in the corner rubbing his aching leg, Walter thought about how Harlon would mock him again tomorrow. He knew his meager money would stretch thinner than ever. But he also knew one thing for sure. Those kids wouldn't be sleeping on the cold concrete anymore. Not as long as he was alive. With that quiet decision, a new bond was sealed. A connection that would echo far louder and longer than he could ever imagine. The days that followed were a testament to sacrifice. Walter worked at the steel factory, where the air was thick with the smell of burnt iron and every clang of machinery seemed to shake his bones. Harlon's taunts became more vicious. "How are the orphans, Green?" he would sneer. "Do they move as slow as you? A charity case raising charity cases." The other workers would laugh, but Walter never snapped back. He just wiped the sweat from his brow and kept working. Every insult, every cruel word was a weight he carried home with him. But at night, the weight seemed to lift. He would open the door, and the children would run to him. The boy, who he learned was named Eli, always had a book in his hand, eager to read to him. His little sister, Grace, sat at their wobbly table, scribbling with a dull pencil, drawing pictures of houses that were warmer and brighter than anything they had ever known. Walter gave them his food when the cupboards were bare. He patched Eli's jacket with clumsy stitches and saved every loose coin he found for Grace's shoes. Some nights, when the heater coughed its last breath for the evening, he would huddle them close, pretending he wasn't cold himself. The neighbors' whispers continued. "A black man raising 2 white kids," one man smirked. "They'll turn on him the first chance they get." Walter heard it all. He heard the venom and the prejudice, but he never answered. Instead, he poured himself into the children. He taught Eli how to change a tire, how to shake a hand with dignity, how to stand up for himself without resorting to violence. He showed Grace how to balance a budget, how to stand tall even when the world tried to make her small. Harlon never let him forget his place. When Walter once asked for a day off to take Grace to the clinic, Harlon sneered, "You're not their father. Stop playing hero and get back to work." But Walter took the day anyway, risking his wages and his job. He walked Grace to the clinic, his hand firm on hers, a silent promise that he would always be there. That night, when Harlon cut his pay in half, Walter hid the pay slip in his pocket, pretending nothing had changed. He would sacrifice anything for them. Years passed this way, each day a new layer of sacrifice. The children grew. Eli, with his sharp mind, earned scholarships Harlon said he would never deserve. Grace, once the timid girl, grew into a fierce and unafraid young woman, a champion of the underdog. Walter watched with a quiet, deep pride. His body grew heavier, his back more bent, but the children stood taller with each passing year. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe his kindness wasn't wasted. Maybe it was a seed he had planted that was finally blooming, far beyond what he could have ever imagined. What Walter didn't know was how closely Harlon had been watching too, and how bitter the man had grown seeing Walter succeed where Harlon had thought he would fail. To Harlon, Walter's happiness and the children's success was an insult. It was proof that Walter had stolen a dignity he didn't deserve. One autumn morning, the trap was sprung. Walter came home from work to find 2 policemen waiting by his door, their uniforms crisp, their expressions cold. A neighbor watched from her window, a smug look on her face. "Told you so," she muttered. "Always knew he'd end up in trouble." The officers shoved past Walter, tearing through his modest apartment. From under the couch cushions, they pulled a small canvas bag stuffed with cash and company equipment, all stamped with factory labels. Walter's breath caught in his chest. He'd never seen it before. Within hours, he was in handcuffs, the metal biting into his wrists. Harlon stood outside the factory gates, arms folded, a triumphant smirk on his face as Walter was led away. "Guess kindness doesn't pay after all, Green," he sneered, loud enough for the other workers to hear. A few laughed, but most just looked away, their faces full of pity. The courtroom smelled of varnish and dust, a smell that made Walter's chest feel tight. He sat hunched in the defendant's chair, his once strong shoulders sagging. The prosecutors painted him as a bitter, greedy old man who'd stolen from his boss to survive. Witnesses, workers Harlon had secretly paid off, claimed they had seen Walter sneaking around the storage rooms. Bystanders filled the benches, their whispers sharp and cruel. "I knew he was too good to be true," one woman whispered. "Those kids he raised don't even know who he really is." Walter said very little. He wanted to scream the truth, to fight back, but years of swallowing insults had trained him into silence. He thought of Eli and Grace. No, he couldn't drag them into this shame. It was better they stayed away, better they never saw him like this. When the judge announced that Walter faced a possible life sentence, the room seemed to close in on itself. The walls pressed tight, the air grew thin. Walter's eyes dropped to the floor, his heart heavy with a final, crushing truth. Maybe Harlon was right. Maybe a man like him was never meant to rise above his place. And then, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Two figures stepped inside, their presence a quiet, unshakable force. Their eyes were fixed on the hunched man at the defendant's table. Eli and Grace. They weren't the shivering, timid children he had carried home decades ago. They were adults now, shaped by the very sacrifices he had thought had gone unnoticed. The room stirred. Whispers turned into gasps. Harlon's triumphant smirk faltered for the first time. Walter's chest tightened. He hadn't wanted them here. But as Eli set down a stack of legal files and Grace lifted a small recorder, scanning the faces in the gallery, he realized something he had never dared to believe. His kindness had not been wasted. It had come back to him, and the battle wasn't over yet. The courtroom was buzzing now, restless as Eli straightened his tie and stepped forward. Gone was the timid boy from the alley. He stood tall, his voice steady as he introduced himself as Walter's defense attorney. He slammed a thick stack of files onto the table, thick with evidence. Grace positioned herself in the gallery, her recorder flashing red. She wasn't just there to watch. As a journalist, she was documenting everything. Her articles had already rattled powerful names, and now her pen was aimed squarely at Harlon. The prosecution tried to maintain control, but Eli cut through their case piece by piece. Witnesses who claimed they saw Walter steal faltered under his calm, pointed questions. One stammered, admitting he had only heard rumors. Another contradicted his own testimony when pressed. Eli exposed the cracks in their stories like a surgeon. Then came the bombshell. Grace rose, requesting permission to share a report. It detailed Harlon's long history of wage theft, harassment, and falsified company accounts at the factory. It was all backed by documents she had unearthed as a journalist. Murmurs swept the room. Harlon's face flushed red, his fists clenching tight. Walter sat frozen, blinking back the sting in his eyes. He had thought the children he saved had outgrown him, moved on to brighter worlds. But here they were, fighting for him with a fire he had unknowingly passed down to them. The judge leaned back, tapping his pen on the bench, weighing the storm that was now unraveling in front of him. "It seems," he finally said, his voice echoing through the stunned silence, "this entire case was built on manipulation." He looked at Walter, then at Harlon. "The charges are dismissed." A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by a ripple of applause. A few jeers were aimed at Harlon as he stormed out, defeated. Eli placed a hand on Walter's shoulder. Grace moved to his other side, whispering, "You don't have to carry it alone anymore, Dad." That single word, Dad, echoed louder than the gavel that had freed him. Neighbors who had once mocked him now fell silent. Reporters scribbled furiously. Walter, old and weary, finally allowed his back to straighten, his head to rise. He had once lifted two children out of the cold. 20 years later, they had lifted him out of a cage. Because kindness doesn't die. It waits. It grows. And when the time is right, it saves. If the story moved you, you're in the right place. Subscribe to join our community and be the first to see our next powerful story. And don't forget to tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from.